The racist cop tried to throw a black woman out of the courtroom, without asking a single question, without checking credentials, without a shred of hesitation. He saw her skin and decided that was enough. Enough to accuse, enough to insult, enough to humiliate. The courtroom was nearly full, buzzing with quiet conversations, attorneys reviewing files, families clinging to hope, reporters waiting to scribble their next big headline. And then everything stopped. All eyes turned as he stormed toward her with cold, mechanical arrogance. The silence in the room thickened with every step he took, and before anyone could make sense of it, his voice cut through the space like a blade. "Ma'am, you're in the wrong place. This area is restricted. Step away from the bench now." She stood still, composed, holding nothing but a folder and the silence of dignity. No robe, no badge, no visible title, just the color of her skin and the grace of her presence. That was all he needed to judge her. When she didn't move fast enough for him, his voice grew louder, slicing through the air again. "I'm not going to ask you again. You're not supposed to be here. Leave before I escort you out myself." The room froze. Even the bailiff looked confused. Whispers broke the stillness. Who was this woman? What was happening? But he didn't care. He was already convinced. And with the fury of authority and the poison of prejudice, he reached out, grabbed her arm, and tried to drag her away from the very seat she had been appointed to preside over. His grip tightened, but her voice was firmer. "Get your hand off me." He scoffed, a cruel smirk stretching across his face as he muttered under his breath, "They'll let anybody in here these days." And he pulled harder, determined to remove the problem from the courtroom. A black woman, standing where he believed she didn't belong. In his eyes, she was just another nobody, overstepping invisible lines drawn by centuries of entitlement. He had no idea she was the one person in that room who had the power to rewrite his future in a single sentence. People gasped, and somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a man stood up and said, "Sir, I think you should stop." But the cop ignored him, too blinded by assumption to see the storm he was about to unleash. This wasn't just disrespect. This wasn't just another bad moment in a long, exhausting history of racial profiling. This was humiliation, public, loud, and violent in its symbolism. This was the kind of pain that doesn't scream, but simmers. The kind that millions have felt in silence. And it happened in the very place where justice is supposed to live. He dragged her 2 steps before she finally turned, looked him in the eyes, and said, calm and sharp as a blade, "You've made a mistake. A big one." She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't need to. The truth was louder than any confrontation. She straightened her shoulders, looked out across the room, at the shocked faces, the silent mouths, the dropped pens, and slowly pulled out her ID from her folder. It was small, precise, and absolute. A federal badge. With her name, her position, and her authority in black and white. And that's when everything changed. Mouths opened, gasps escaped, and the silence shattered like glass. The cop's grip released in a stutter. He blinked, as if trying to understand what had just happened. But it was too late. He had made his choice. He had acted on his bias. And now the entire courtroom saw it, felt it, would remember it. But this isn't just about one moment in one courtroom. This is about what happened next. About what she did, not just to reclaim her dignity, but to transform her pain into power. About how one act of arrogance set off a chain reaction that would shake an entire institution. Because this wasn't the first time he'd let his racism take the wheel. And she wasn't the first black person he tried to erase. But she would be the last. What followed was not revenge, but justice. Not rage, but resolve. She didn't just speak up, she acted. With every tool the law gave her. With the patience of someone who's been disrespected too many times and the strength of someone who's never let it break her. Because this woman wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol. A reminder that dignity isn't something you're given, it's something you demand. That silence in the face of injustice only feeds it. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do, is simply reveal who you really are. But what did she do next? How did she hold him accountable? What truth did she reveal that made the entire courtroom, and later, the entire country, question not just him, but the system that allowed him to act this way for so long? And what consequences did he face when he realized he hadn't tried to throw out a trespasser, but the federal judge presiding over his own future? Stay with us. You need to hear what happened next. Before we dive into today's powerful story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black viewers. At Plow of Twist, we stand with you. We do not tolerate racism in any form. This platform is a space for justice, truth, and powerful stories that reflect real emotions and real lives. If you've ever been silenced, underestimated, or disrespected simply for who you are, this story is for you. You matter. Your story matters. Your strength inspires us. Now, get ready for a gripping journey that will keep you hooked till the end. And hey, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our community. We're just getting started. Her name was Judge Monique Harris, though few knew it when she walked into the federal courthouse that morning in downtown Birmingham, Alabama. The building stood tall and gray under the heavy southern sky, framed by the fading remains of a city still learning to reckon with its own past. Monique had passed through those courthouse doors thousands of times before, but that morning was different, not because of any particular case, not because of any special agenda, but because of the way the air felt thick with the quiet tension that always seemed to cling to spaces where power was held but not often shared. Monique wasn't the kind of woman who demanded attention when she walked into a room, but silence often followed her anyway. She carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Her presence spoke of long nights spent buried in case law, of battles fought not in rage but in persistence. She was in her early 40s, the kind of woman who aged with clarity rather than wear, her natural curls pulled back into a neat low bun, her eyes sharp but calm, and her voice measured, never rushed. She had grown up in the same city she now served, in a neighborhood that bore the scars of policies written by hands that never lived there. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still made it to every parent-teacher meeting, Monique knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be told she didn't belong, to be spoken over. And yet, she rose. Her path to the bench was anything but traditional. She had started as a public defender, not because it paid well, it didn't, but because she knew too many people who couldn't afford a second chance and never got a first. She spent years defending names no one would remember, people who the system chewed up before it even learned how to pronounce them. Her work was gritty, thankless, and exhausting, but she earned a reputation, one not just of brilliance, but of integrity. Eventually, she transitioned to federal prosecution, where her deep sense of justice and sharp legal mind made her not just respected, but feared. By the time she was nominated for a federal judgeship, even those who had once doubted her couldn't find a valid reason to say no. That morning, she had chosen not to wear her robe just yet. The hearing wasn't set to begin for another 30 minutes, and she wanted to review the case file alone in the courtroom before it filled with people. She moved through the courthouse with the quiet familiarity of someone who had memorized every step, her badge tucked into her bag, her mind focused on the complexity of the civil rights case scheduled for the day. It involved allegations of excessive force, again. She had read the depositions late into the night, unable to shake the testimony of a 17-year-old boy who had described being stopped, thrown to the ground, and detained without cause. The name of the arresting officer was familiar. Officer Bradley Kinley had served in the city's police department for over a decade. On paper, he had commendations. In person, he had attitude. Behind closed doors, in whispered conversations among public defenders and young prosecutors, there were other stories, unofficial, undocumented, but consistent. Stories about how he treated young black men during traffic stops, how he spoke to single mothers in housing disputes, how he seemed to escalate situations that called for de-escalation. But no one had ever caught him in a way that would stick. Until now. He was already in the building that morning, assigned as courthouse security. He wore his uniform like armor, stiff and spotless, his posture always too rigid, as if daring someone to challenge his authority. He had never met Judge Harris in person. He had seen her name on dockets, maybe glanced at a file or two, but in his mind, federal judge still conjured the image of an older white man in a tailored suit, not a black woman in a tan coat walking toward the front of the courtroom with a folder in her hands. When he saw her standing near the bench without a robe, flipping through documents, his instincts kicked in, not the instincts of protocol, but the ones forged in bias and unchecked power. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask if she was lost. He saw her, and decided she didn't belong. Monique barely had time to process his approach before his voice cracked through the silence like a whip. His tone was sharp, demanding, completely devoid of respect or curiosity. She looked up, startled, confused. He stepped closer, louder now, issuing orders without pause. She tried to speak, but he cut her off. The few people already in the room paused what they were doing, heads slowly turning, unsure of what they were witnessing. She had entered through the side entrance, normal for judges, unusual to outsiders. He saw none of this. All he saw was a black woman standing somewhere he thought she shouldn't be. The moment was short, but stretched into eternity. When he grabbed her arm, her body tensed, not in fear, but in disbelief. She had dealt with disrespect before, subtle and insidious, but this was raw, physical, undeniable. Her voice, low but firm, told him to let go. He didn't. Not until she reached into her folder and pulled out her identification with deliberate calm, holding it up for the room to see. Only then did he pause. His hand slipped away. His face contorted in confusion, then panic. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder, rippling through the rows like a wave. He had no idea what he had just done. Outside that room, the world kept spinning. In the judge's chambers, clerks prepared for the day's schedule. On the courthouse steps, reporters adjusted camera angles. But inside, something had shifted. A line had been crossed. And not by mistake. The silence that followed his action wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Recognition of how easily power assumes guilt. How quickly dignity is dismissed. How a black woman, no matter how accomplished, can be reduced to nothing more than suspicion in the eyes of someone who refuses to see her. Judge Harris didn't explode. She didn't raise her voice or demand retribution. She stood still, shoulders square, her voice even. But in that stillness, there was fire. Not of vengeance, but of purpose. She didn't need to punish him to make a statement. Her presence alone was enough to unravel the foundation of everything he thought he knew about authority. Back in the security office, whispers had already started. Her name began to circulate. A few officers stiffened, eyes widening as the realization sank in. This wasn't over. And not because she was going to file a complaint or make a scene. Because she was the law. And the law, in her hands, had a memory. Officer Kinley would go on with his day, his hands still shaking slightly. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't yet see, was that this moment would follow him far beyond that building. Into every hallway. Every hearing. Every closed-door meeting where his name would appear again, but this time under a very different light. And somewhere in that building, Judge Harris sat quietly, rereading her notes for the case. Not flinching. Not rattled. Just focused. Because today, she had more than one injustice to address. And what happened next would change everything. The morning air in the courthouse was colder than usual, a quiet chill that clung to the walls long after the heating system kicked in. Judge Monique Harris sat behind her desk, the heavy wood framing her posture like a throne, though her expression carried none of the grandeur. Her eyes stayed fixed on the digital clock on the far wall, her mind already running through arguments, counterpoints, constitutional precedents. But underneath that sharp focus, there was something else simmering, a slow burn that had started when Officer Kinley's hand gripped her arm, when the weight of assumption tried to drag her from her rightful place. She had pushed the feeling aside, buried it beneath her work, but it lingered, steady and unforgiving. That moment hadn't just humiliated her, it had triggered something far deeper. Something generational. And she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. The courtroom filled quickly. The civil rights case scheduled for the day had drawn a larger crowd than usual. Attorneys shuffled through papers, law students scribbled in notebooks, and a handful of reporters sat poised, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Across the aisle, the plaintiff, Isaiah Bell, sat with his mother. The 17-year-old looked tired beyond his years. He avoided eye contact, his hands locked together on his lap, eyes darting toward the uniformed officers in the back. Monique saw the way his shoulders flinched each time one of them moved. She noticed how his mother kept whispering something to him, probably reminders to breathe, to be calm, to trust. On the defense side, the city's legal team sat polished and ready, led by an attorney who had built a reputation on technicalities and settlements. He leaned over to whisper something to the officer sitting beside him, Bradley Kinley. The same officer from that morning. The same man who now sat in full uniform, arms crossed, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't looked up once since she entered the courtroom. And she hadn't acknowledged him either. Not yet. The first half of the hearing unfolded as expected. Evidence was presented, body cam footage shown, though much of it was inconclusive. Witness statements were read aloud, some damning, others carefully neutral. Monique listened, took notes, and kept her tone even. But her eyes never fully softened. When the plaintiff's attorney stood to cross-examine the officer, something shifted. The attorney, young, bold, clearly passionate, stepped forward and asked, "Officer Kinley, can you confirm the time and location where you detained Mr. Bell?" Kinley cleared his throat and nodded, "Yes, it was March 4th, around 8:30 p.m., near the corner of 15th and Greenfield." "And what was your probable cause for detaining him?" The officer shifted slightly in his seat, suspicious behavior. He was walking briskly, looking over his shoulder repeatedly, and matched the description of a suspect reported in the area. "Was he carrying any weapon?" "No." "Any drugs?" "No." "So, you detained him for walking?" "I detained him for suspicious behavior." The lawyer stepped back and looked at the judge briefly before continuing, "Suspicious behavior. That's subjective, isn't it, officer?" Kinley leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening, "It's based on training and experience." The judge said nothing, but her fingers tapped slowly against her notebook. "Is it your experience that young black men walking alone at night are suspicious?" the lawyer pressed. The courtroom stiffened. A few gasps echoed softly. Kinley straightened his back, "That's not what I said." "But it is what you did," the lawyer replied, and turned to the judge, "No further questions, Your Honor." Monique looked down at her notes, then back at the officer. For the first time since the hearing began, she addressed him directly. Her voice was clear but without theatrics. "Officer Kinley, remain seated. I have a few questions." He visibly tensed. She let the silence grow long before speaking again. "Can you describe the protocol you followed that night?" He nodded, reciting a textbook answer about radio dispatch, neighborhood patterns, and officer discretion. She interrupted gently, "And at what point did Mr. Bell resist arrest?" There was a pause. "He didn't." "Was he disrespectful?" "No." "Did he flee?" "No." "Did he speak to you at all?" "He asked why he was being detained." She leaned slightly forward, her tone still calm, "And how did you respond?" "I told him to stay quiet and comply." She waited a beat, then said, "I see." Another long pause filled the room. Monique let it linger. Then she turned her attention back to the attorneys. "We'll resume with closing statements tomorrow. Court is adjourned for today." As people began to file out, Monique remained seated. Isaiah and his mother approached quietly. "Thank you," his mother said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for seeing us." Monique nodded, a soft smile breaking through. You were seen long before today, ma'am. Today just made it official. That evening, Monique stayed late in her chambers. She pulled out an older case file, one that had been closed too quickly. A traffic stop that ended in unnecessary force. The officer involved? Kinley. She opened another. A housing dispute where a single mother claimed verbal abuse by a responding officer. No charges were filed. Kinley again. The pattern was no longer just anecdotal. It was documented, buried in bureaucracy, hidden by legal language and red tape. But now it had a spotlight. The following day, Monique walked into the courtroom earlier than usual. She felt something shift when she passed Kinley in the hallway. He didn't meet her gaze. But she noticed the hesitation in his step. He knew the tides were turning, even if he didn't understand just how far they would reach. Before closing arguments began, Monique requested a private sidebar with both legal teams. In chambers, her tone was firm. I'm reopening 2 prior cases involving Officer Kinley. One involving excessive force during a routine traffic stop. Another, harassment during a domestic call. These are connected by more than just coincidence. The city attorney protested, Your Honor, this isn't relevant to the current trial, it speaks to a pattern of conduct, Monique cut in. One that the court cannot ignore. The tension was thick. The attorneys exchanged glances. Kinley, still outside, paced the corridor like a man walking toward a cliff. After the chamber session, word spread quickly through the courthouse. Staff whispered, clerks leaned in, even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. Something was coming. Something big. And Monique didn't hide from it, she prepared for it. Back at home, she sat alone at her kitchen table. Her mother called, asking if everything was okay. Monique told her it was just another long week. But in her chest, she felt the weight of what was building, not just a professional reckoning, but a personal one. Because this wasn't about one cop. It was about every hallway she had walked through quietly, every time she'd been spoken over, every chair she'd had to earn twice as hard. It was all culminating in a single question, what does accountability really look like? And when she answered that question, it wouldn't be with anger. It would be with evidence, law, and the undeniable power of truth. The next morning, as the courthouse buzzed with anticipation, Kinley arrived early. But this time, he didn't carry the same posture. Something in his stance had cracked. He walked slower. Looked over his shoulder more. He sat at the defense table, but didn't speak. And when Monique entered, he finally looked up. Their eyes met. She didn't blink. What she was about to reveal wouldn't just change the course of one case, it would alter the path of his entire career. And he had no idea what she was about to do. The courtroom was uncomfortably quiet as the clock approached 10. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, but no one seemed to notice. The anticipation was tangible, hanging in the air like a thread stretched to its breaking point. Every seat was filled, every phone silenced, and every pair of eyes focused on the empty bench at the front of the room. When Judge Monique Harris finally entered, there was no fanfare. No announcement. Just the sound of her heels striking the floor in calm, steady rhythm. She took her place with grace, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at Officer Kinley. Not yet. Her gaze swept across the room, absorbing every face, every nuance, every expectation. She began with a tone of formality, inviting both sides to deliver their closing arguments. The plaintiff's attorney spoke with measured passion, detailing the constitutional violations with a precision that left no room for doubt. He referenced body cam footage, audio inconsistencies, eyewitness contradictions. But beyond that, he reminded the court of what couldn't be seen in documents, the fear in Isaiah Bell's eyes, the long-term trauma etched into his posture, the silence he carried because he was taught that speaking up would make it worse. The city's defense, by contrast, leaned heavily on procedure. They insisted on protocol, emphasized the lack of physical injury, dismissed the claims as misunderstandings. But their confidence was thinner than before. The room could feel it. When the arguments ended, Monique paused. A long, deliberate pause that made even the most seasoned attorneys shift in their seats. Then she spoke, not as a judge delivering a ruling, but as a woman delivering a reckoning. "Before this court reaches a decision," she said slowly, "there is one matter I feel compelled to address publicly." The murmur in the courtroom stopped instantly. Even the court reporter looked up, pen hovering in midair. She turned her gaze toward Officer Kinley, who sat stiff, hands clasped too tightly, eyes locked to the desk in front of him. "Officer Kinley," she began, her voice calm but resonant, "your actions on the night in question have been under scrutiny during this trial. But so have your actions in other instances. Until now, those incidents were considered unrelated. Today, that changes." He looked up, first confused, then cautious. Monique reached into a file resting on her desk. She pulled out 3 folders, stacked with reports and transcripts, each marked by a different name, a different date, a different accusation. She laid them out in front of her like evidence in a puzzle that had just found its final piece. "In the interest of transparency," she continued, "this court reopened 2 prior complaints against you in the past 72 hours. Both were originally dismissed. Both involved similar circumstances. One involved a traffic stop where the complainant alleged verbal harassment and unjust detention. The other concerned a call to a residential neighborhood, in which a tenant reported you for threats and racial slurs during what should have been a simple noise complaint resolution. Neither case resulted in disciplinary action." Kinley's jaw tensed. His attorney placed a hand on his arm but didn't speak. Monique leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "This morning, those 2 complainants gave sworn affidavits. I reviewed them personally. I also reviewed body cam footage that, curiously, was never included in the original internal investigations. I found them enlightening." Kinley's eyes flickered toward his attorney, whose hand tightened slightly. "What I find most alarming," Monique continued, her voice now cutting through the air like glass, "is the pattern, how remarkably consistent your language is when dealing with individuals of color. How frequently you deviate from standard protocol. How comfortable you are raising your voice, even laying hands on someone, when you believe they lack the authority to question you." She stood slowly, taking a breath before continuing. "And I should know, Officer Kinley. Because just 2 days ago, you put your hands on me." A ripple of shock exploded through the room, gasps colliding with stunned silence. For the first time, Kinley's face drained of color. His body froze. Reporters leaned forward in their chairs, pens already moving. The plaintiff's mother covered her mouth. Even the bailiff seemed rooted in place. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "In your rush to assert control, you never asked who I was. You saw a black woman near the bench and assumed she did not belong. You attempted to remove me from my courtroom, without question, without cause, without a second thought. That's not a misunderstanding. That's not poor judgment. That's bias. That's misconduct. And it's unacceptable." Kinley opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Monique continued, her voice sharper now. "I have filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice and with the Internal Affairs Division of the Birmingham Police Department. In addition, I have recused myself from any further rulings regarding your actions, because as of this moment, you are no longer a neutral party in this court, you are a subject of federal investigation." She turned to the courtroom staff, "Effective immediately, Officer Kinley is suspended from all courthouse duties pending investigation." There was no yelling. No shouting. Just the pure silence of justice finally speaking for itself. Kinley stood, his movements stiff, eyes wide with disbelief. He turned toward his attorney who shook his head subtly, indicating not to resist. The courtroom guards approached, not with hostility, but with firm authority. As they guided him toward the side exit, a hush followed his every step. His badge no longer shielded him. His reputation, once protected by silence and bureaucracy, now unraveled in real time. As the doors closed behind him, Monique looked back at the plaintiff, at the young man who had walked into that courtroom afraid, uncertain of whether his truth would be believed. She met his eyes and nodded once. "I want this to be clear," she said, her voice steady again. "This court does not just hear arguments. It listens. And it acts. No one, no matter their badge, their title, or their years of service, is above accountability." Outside, reporters swarmed the steps. Inside, the tension finally broke. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of oppression. It felt like a space reclaimed. Monique remained still for a long moment. Her heart was pounding, though her face didn't show it. The risk she had taken, the boundary she had crossed, it had not been easy. But it was necessary. And it wasn't just about her. It was about Isaiah. It was about the nameless faces in those forgotten files. It was about every person who had walked into a courtroom expecting justice and found only silence. The trial was over. But something else had just begun. What would happen next, how the system would respond, what the consequences would be, how far the ripples would travel, remained to be seen. But one thing was clear. The woman Kinley tried to throw out of her own courtroom had just rewritten the rules. And the whole country was about to find out what that really meant. The hallway outside the courtroom echoed with the low hum of confusion, murmurs blending with the sharp clicks of hurried footsteps and whispered questions exchanged between legal assistants and reporters. Officer Kinley stood off to the side, flanked by 2 internal security agents who had received a direct order from the chief judge to escort him out, not as a criminal yet, but certainly not as an officer in good standing. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, not because he feared physical danger, but because the ground beneath his life, his career, his image, his carefully guarded authority, had cracked open so suddenly he hadn't found solid footing since. His attorney trailed behind him, expression tight, eyes darting as if trying to measure the exact damage before deciding how much of it was still salvageable. Inside the courtroom, the tension hadn't left. It had only changed form. What was once quiet anticipation had transformed into an electric awareness. Everyone had witnessed something they weren't prepared for, something bigger than a ruling. They had seen a system pull back its curtain, just enough for the truth to show its face. And now, they were watching the woman who had pulled that curtain, Judge Monique Harris, stand taller than ever, not because of her title, but because of the integrity she had just displayed in full view of the public. After a short recess, the courtroom returned to session. The plaintiff, Isaiah Bell, looked at his mother with wide, uncertain eyes. She squeezed his hand without saying a word, but the message was there: "You're safe now." Judge Harris called the room to order, but before continuing with the verdict, she turned to the plaintiff's attorney. "I would like the court to hear one last statement," she said, her tone softer now, yet unmistakably firm. "Mr. Bell, if you're comfortable, you may speak." Isaiah froze. His mother's hand remained steady on his, but he looked from her to the judge, uncertain whether this was a test or an opportunity. Then slowly, hesitantly, he stood. His voice was low at first, cracking slightly. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," he said, looking around at the faces now locked on him. "That night. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just trying to get home. I took the long way because I didn't want to walk past the gas station, there's always guys hanging out there, and I didn't want no trouble." He paused, took a deep breath, then continued. "When he stopped me, he didn't ask anything. He just told me to get on the ground. I didn't understand why. I kept asking what I did wrong, but he kept yelling. I thought if I moved the wrong way, I'd die. And I couldn't explain that to anyone. My friends said it happens all the time. My mom told me to stay quiet, to just get through it. But I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I saw a police car, I couldn't breathe." His voice grew stronger, not louder, but clearer. When I found out I had to come to court, I thought it wouldn't matter. I thought they'd just say it was a misunderstanding. But then I saw you, Your Honor. And when you spoke today. I don't know, I believed it could change. There was a silence after his words that carried more weight than any argument made that week. Monique nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. Thank you, she said gently. Your courage is noted by this court. Then she turned toward the gallery, her tone shifting once again. It is not easy to speak truth in a place where truth has been manipulated for power. It takes more strength than we often acknowledge. And when we ignore those voices, we become complicit in the very systems we claim to uphold. The verdict came next, and it was clear. The court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, awarding not only damages but initiating a formal inquiry into the officer's conduct as part of a broader review of the department's policies. But that wasn't what lingered when the session adjourned. It was what came after. Outside the courthouse, reporters flooded the front steps. Microphones were shoved forward. Questions rang out. But Monique didn't take the front door. She walked down a quieter hallway, one she had used many times before. And just past the main exit, a voice called out. Judge Harris, wait. It was Kinley. He was alone, standing by the bench that lined the corridor wall, a man no longer covered by his uniform. His face was pale, not from rage, but something deeper, disorientation, disbelief, maybe even shame. Monique stopped. Their eyes locked again, but this time, the silence between them felt different. He spoke first. His voice was quieter than she remembered. You really went through with it. She said nothing. I didn't know, he continued, forcing each word out like it cost him. I didn't know who you were. That's the problem, she replied. He looked away, swallowing hard. I didn't mean for it to be like that. I've served this city for years. I've put my life on the line. You've never been held accountable, she interrupted, not harshly, but firmly. That's what you meant. His shoulders sank slightly, the weight finally settling on him. I lost everything, he said. They're going to make an example out of me. You were never supposed to be the example, she replied. You were supposed to be the warning. But now, yes, you're the example. Because you crossed a line you didn't even know existed. And it wasn't the line of rank, or protocol. It was the line between power and justice. He nodded, slowly, as if the words were finally starting to land. I messed up, he admitted. She didn't comfort him. She didn't minimize it. But she didn't walk away either. You made a choice, she said. And now the system you served has to choose too, whether to protect its own image or its integrity. There was a long pause before she spoke again. I hope you understand why this had to happen. And I hope you change. But even if you don't, someone watching this will. And then she left. No applause. No drama. Just footsteps echoing down a hallway that, for once, didn't feel so heavy. Back in her chambers, Monique exhaled for the first time in hours. She sat down, not in triumph, but in resolve. She thought of Isaiah. She thought of her mother. She thought of the young law student she used to be, terrified of speaking too loud in case someone decided she was out of place. And she thought about how many others still walked through courtrooms feeling invisible. Today wasn't about her victory. It was about theirs. Outside, news vans circled like vultures, but Monique didn't plan on giving any interviews. Her work wasn't finished. This was just the surface. The real change, policy, reform, education, accountability, that was the long road. But today proved it could be walked. And far away from all the cameras, in a quiet home in the north side of the city, a mother hugged her son just a little longer than usual. Not because the fight was over. But because for the first time in a long time, they had been heard. The courthouse buzzed in hushed fragments during the days that followed. Whispers echoed down long hallways, where clerks passed each other with subtle glances, and even the usual chatter in the lobby had dimmed to an uneasy murmur. Though no official statement had yet been issued, the story had spread like wildfire, not because of press releases or viral clips, but because people had felt the shift themselves. A judge had not only broken ranks to speak on an internal injustice, she had done it with a stillness and strength that left the institution no choice but to respond. Officer Bradley Kinley's suspension, while formally described as pending investigation, had quickly evolved into a deeper internal audit, one that started probing into complaint archives previously brushed aside or sealed by bureaucracy. Names that had once been forgotten were now resurfacing, voices that had once whispered in fear now getting calls from oversight committees asking for interviews. The tremors hadn't stopped, they were just beginning. For Monique Harris, the days were anything but quiet. The hours in her chambers extended far past sunset. Reporters left messages with her assistants. Advocacy groups emailed requests for comment. Law school professors sent her letters, asking to cite her decision as precedent in their civil liberties courses. Still, she hadn't spoken publicly. Every word she chose now had weight. And though part of her felt a magnetic pull toward speaking out, a greater part knew that what mattered most was not her voice, but the system's response. It had been so easy for her colleagues in the past to issue vague statements about isolated incidents and individual misconduct. Now, with the veil pulled back, would they be willing to ask harder questions about complicity? On the third morning after the ruling, she met with the chief administrative judge. The meeting wasn't scheduled, it had been requested late the night before in a curt email. His office was colder than usual, the blinds closed, a thick silence between them. He was an older man, well respected, known for his composure and detachment. But today, his detachment looked more like discomfort. "You understand what you've done, right?" he asked, folding his hands slowly on the desk between them. Monique met his gaze without hesitation. "I enforced the law. I upheld my oath." "You undermined protocol," he replied. "You involved yourself in an ongoing investigation. I disclosed everything necessary to justify my recusal. I acted with full transparency." He exhaled through his nose, eyes narrowing slightly. "And now we have civil rights groups knocking on our door, demanding disciplinary reviews for half the force. We have 3 more officers under preliminary scrutiny. You've triggered something we can't control." She leaned forward slightly. Maybe that's exactly what was needed. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "This will escalate. And not everyone will support how you've handled this. Some are saying you overstepped." "I didn't overstep," she said calmly. "I revealed what was already there." His silence said more than his words. Outside the office, Monique took a long breath before returning to her chambers. Her staff greeted her quietly. No celebration. No congratulations. Just understanding. She appreciated that most of all. The quiet solidarity, the respect that didn't need applause. But the real dilemma came later that afternoon, when her assistant handed her a sealed envelope from the Office of Professional Responsibility. She opened it carefully. Inside was a confidential report, an initial recommendation to suspend Kinley without pay pending a formal hearing, but it came with a note: "Given the profile of the incident and your direct involvement, we advise refraining from further engagement in disciplinary actions to preserve impartiality." It wasn't just a procedural suggestion, it was a warning. A signal that even now, the system valued appearance over integrity. That if she continued pushing, even from the sidelines, her future as a judge might be in question. She sat with that envelope for hours. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. Her authority had been earned, not gifted. And while she had always been willing to challenge the system, she knew the cost of being labeled divisive in institutions where neutrality was often mistaken for silence. The pressure wasn't overt. It didn't need to be. It came in the form of careful language, veiled concerns, and strategic distancing. And still, she knew she couldn't stop. That evening, Monique received an unexpected visitor. Isaiah's mother arrived unannounced, standing just outside the courthouse security gate, holding a small brown envelope in her hands. When Monique came down to meet her, she offered a tired smile. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice soft. "I just wanted to give you this." Inside the envelope was a photograph. Isaiah, smiling. Standing next to a whiteboard with the words, "First Day of College Prep," written in bold blue marker. Monique looked at it for a long time before speaking. "He told me he's thinking about studying law," the woman added. "He says he wants to be the kind of person who listens." Monique's throat tightened slightly. She nodded, pressing the envelope gently to her chest. "That's the kind of justice I want to serve," she said. Back in her office, she placed the photo on her desk, beside her gavel, beside the books that had carried her through every chapter of her career. It grounded her. It reminded her that cases weren't about headlines. They were about lives. But as the city reacted, some with praise, others with resistance, the question became more complicated. Local police unions issued statements defending Kinley, citing his years of service. A conservative commentator on the evening news accused Monique of abusing her bench to push a personal agenda. Her face began to appear on television, her words dissected, her silence mocked, her dignity questioned. And all around her, the same colleagues who had shaken her hand in court hallways now avoided eye contact. Some out of guilt. Others out of fear. Yet, among the criticism came a letter. Handwritten. From a retired judge in Georgia, who had served for over 40 years. It said simply, "You reminded the law what its purpose is. Don't let them forget." Monique kept that letter close. Because even now, she was unsure how far the system would allow her to go before pushing her out. Whether she could reform from within or if she'd be forced to fight from outside. The dilemma was no longer just ethical. It was personal. If she stayed silent, she'd keep her seat. If she kept fighting, she might lose everything. But then came the subpoena. The Federal Oversight Committee, now deep into its investigation, requested Monique's appearance not as a judge, but as a witness. They wanted her testimony regarding the atmosphere inside the courthouse, prior complaints she'd heard about, incidents not on record but mentioned in passing over the years. It was a line she had never crossed. Judges were expected to remain impartial, above the fray. But here she was, being asked not to rule, but to speak. To tell the truth. Out loud. In public. She looked at the notice for a long time, the weight of it pressing down hard. Would telling the truth cost her career? Would staying quiet cost her soul? The dilemma burned inside her, complex and unforgiving. There was no easy answer. Only the memory of a hand gripping her arm, a teenager who almost gave up on being heard, a courtroom full of people who had watched power surrender to truth. And the knowledge that the most dangerous silence of all, was the one she could still choose. The day Monique Harris stepped into the federal building to give her testimony, the sky was gray and low, mirroring the weight that sat across her shoulders. She wore her robe, not for show, but as a reminder, to herself, more than anyone else, of what she stood for. The air was thick with anticipation, not just from the press crowded behind barricades, but from within. She had walked through that lobby thousands of times, usually invisible to the noise outside. Today, the cameras followed every step. Some faces in the crowd looked at her with admiration, others with suspicion, and a few with open contempt. But she kept her eyes forward. Because this wasn't about appearance. This was about truth. Inside, the hearing room was stark and cold, nothing like the warm wood and tradition of a courtroom. The committee panel sat at the front, a long table lined with nameplates and microphones, each member with a stack of notes before them. She knew the structure: opening statements, guided questions, official timekeeping, but what she didn't know was how much of this was formality and how much was genuine pursuit of justice. As she sat down and adjusted the mic, she glanced briefly at the audience behind her. Some familiar faces. Isaiah and his mother. A few of her staff. A couple of retired judges. But most were strangers, observers, journalists, legal interns, all waiting to see which line she would choose to cross. The first questions were simple. Her credentials. Her tenure. Her role in the case. She answered clearly, professionally, giving nothing more than what the protocol required. But it didn't take long before the tone shifted. A younger congressman leaned in, voice laced with subtle accusation, and asked if she felt it was appropriate to publicly intervene in a case involving courthouse staff. Monique paused, then replied with calm steadiness. I didn't intervene. I exercised oversight. It's not only appropriate, it's required when misconduct is evident. He followed up, pressing, do you believe that your personal experience with Officer Kinley compromised your ability to remain impartial? She looked him directly in the eye. No. I believe it illuminated a broader issue that had gone unaddressed for too long. My personal experience didn't bias me. It revealed a systemic pattern that needed to be confronted. Another member of the panel shifted papers and asked if she had ever heard informal complaints about similar behavior from other officers. Monique hesitated, then answered with a slight nod. Yes. On multiple occasions. Not always in official terms. But enough to recognize a pattern. The questions kept coming, each one chipping away at the protective layer the institution had wrapped around itself for years. With each answer, Monique felt the tension rising, but not from fear. It was clarity. Like scraping away dust from a mirror until the image underneath becomes undeniable. Then, toward the end of the session, came the question that stopped her breath for half a second. Judge Harris, in your opinion, does the current system adequately hold officers accountable for their behavior inside courtrooms? She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, then opened them slowly. No. It doesn't. Accountability isn't just about consequences. It's about visibility. And until now, much of this behavior operated in the shadows. If I hadn't been wearing this robe, no one would have believed me. And even now, some still don't. The room fell silent. Her words hung in the air like smoke. When the hearing adjourned, she didn't wait for a debrief. She walked out through a side exit, finding a brief stretch of quiet in a back hallway. There, leaning against the wall, was Isaiah. He looked different than before, more grounded, older somehow. I watched the whole thing, he said. I never thought someone like me could make that much of a difference. She shook her head, a soft smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't just you. It was all the voices like yours that were never heard. You just happened to speak at the right time. He looked down, then back up. Do you think they'll actually change anything? Monique considered her words carefully. Not right away. But this? It's a crack. In something they never thought would break. And cracks spread. The boy nodded, eyes shining just slightly. I want to be a lawyer now. She touched his shoulder gently. Then be better than the ones who ignored you. That night, back at home, Monique sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the cicadas humming softly in the trees. Her phone vibrated. A text from a colleague in D.C., they're watching you. Just be careful. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. She already knew. But she also knew she wasn't afraid. What scared her more than being watched was returning to silence. The machine could grind its gears all it wanted, what mattered was that it had been made to stop, even if just for a moment, and look at itself. A few days later, the official report from the Federal Committee was released. It recommended sweeping changes in courthouse security training, new reporting protocols, and the re-evaluation of internal affairs investigations over the past 5 years. It wasn't everything. But it was something. And most notably, It included a line: "In acknowledgement of the actions taken by Judge Monique Harris, this committee recognizes the courage required to challenge internal misconduct within the justice system." It wasn't an award. It wasn't praise. But it was acknowledgement. And in a world where silence had often been the safest language spoken, acknowledgement was powerful. Still, not everyone celebrated. Conservative circles called it judicial activism. Former officers penned op-eds warning of dangerous precedents. Anonymous threats trickled into her inbox. Her clerks received strange calls. One morning, someone scratched the word "traitor" into her car door. But she never changed her route to work. Never looked over her shoulder more than necessary. Because the fear they tried to sell her, she had already paid in full a long time ago. In one final meeting, before the court summer recess, the chief administrative judge requested to speak with her again. This time, his tone was different. "You're being considered for an appointment to the state appellate court," he said plainly. "Despite everything, or maybe because of it. I thought you should know." She raised an eyebrow, more curious than impressed. "And what do you think?" He sighed, looked down at the papers on his desk, then back at her. "I think we need people in that seat who remember what it feels like to be pushed out of their own courtroom." She stood to leave, offering him a rare, sincere nod. "Then maybe we're finally learning something." Outside, the world moved on. Cases continued. Files were filed. New officers were sworn in. But something was different now. It was in the way young clerks looked at her, the way law students referenced her in debates, the way old colleagues stopped mid-sentence when she entered a room. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. And perhaps, most importantly, in the courtroom where it all began, there was now a photo hung near the judge's bench. It wasn't of her. It was of Isaiah Bell, smiling, his college prep sign in hand. Below it, a plaque read, "May we never question the worth of a voice that dares to speak." Monique stood before it one morning, alone, before court began. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stood in silence for a moment, honoring everything that voice had meant. Then she turned, adjusted her robe, and walked into her courtroom, one that would never again belong to silence. The courthouse felt different now. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, an energy shift more than anything tangible. People spoke a little softer, listened a little more carefully. New security protocols had been implemented quickly, quietly. Officers were required to undergo implicit bias training, and complaints were now processed with an independent review panel that bypassed internal affairs entirely. Monique Harris noticed these changes not with celebration, but with cautious awareness. Change, she knew, was not a single moment, it was endurance. It required vigilance, patience, and the understanding that for every step forward, there were forces waiting to drag things back. But still, it was happening. On a humid Monday morning, she was scheduled to preside over a case involving a young woman accused of disorderly conduct during a protest outside a housing complex. The file indicated she had no prior charges, was a student, and had been released without bail. The charge, Monique suspected, was more about intimidation than justice. As she read through the witness statements, she noticed something curious. One of the arresting officers listed on the report was a new name, recently transferred in. She made a note to pay attention. Patterns always began somewhere. Before court began, she stepped into her chambers and found her assistant waiting by the door, visibly hesitant. In her hand, she held an envelope. "Another letter," she said, and handed it over without meeting Monique's eyes. Monique took it gently, sensing the tension. She opened the envelope and found a handwritten note inside. The handwriting was careful, almost rehearsed. "I've been thinking about everything you said," it began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say I see it now. All of it. Not just what I did, but what I refuse to see. I'll live with it. I hope you keep doing what you're doing. Even if no one else says it, I'm glad you didn't let me walk away untouched. It was unsigned. But she didn't need a name. The message was clear. The reckoning had reached even the ones who thought themselves untouchable. She folded the note slowly, tucked it into the back of her journal, and stood for a long moment before returning to the courtroom. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a local college, an event meant to highlight women in law. She hesitated. Public speaking, outside of her role, still felt unfamiliar. But something about the invitation resonated. She accepted quietly, without announcement. The auditorium was filled with students, faculty, and alumni. The moderator, a young black woman in her final year of law school, opened with a question that caught Monique off guard. "What did it feel like," she asked, "to have to prove your right to exist in a space you already earned?" Monique paused. The silence stretched long before she answered. "It felt like walking into a room built to look like justice, but furnished with suspicion," she said. "It felt like being measured by your presence before your words. And it felt like knowing, deep in your bones, that you couldn't afford to be angry, even when you had every right to be." The audience sat in silence, no one daring to speak. Monique continued. "But it also felt like clarity. Like the moment you realize you are not alone. That even if they try to silence you, someone's listening. That justice isn't something handed down, it's something you demand, again and again, until it sticks." After the talk, a line formed. Students asked for advice, shared their own stories of marginalization, told her how much her decision had meant to them. One young man, barely 20, stood before her with tears in his eyes. "My father was arrested by that same officer," he whispered. "Back in 2016. No one believed us. Not even the lawyer we hired. I just wanted you to know, we never thought anyone would care." Monique reached out, gently touching his arm. "I care," she said. "And now, so do more people than you think." But as her public profile grew, so did the consequences. Anonymous calls became more frequent. Messages left on her windshield, voicemails filled with veiled threats. Nothing actionable, but enough to wear down even the strongest will. Her staff became more guarded. Her clerk started walking her to her car at night. Even within the court, tensions rose. A fellow judge pulled her aside in the hallway one morning, eyes cautious. "They're watching your docket," he warned. "Waiting for a mistake. Be careful." She nodded, but inside, something stirred, an old fire reigniting. She had not come this far to shrink. If they were watching, then let them watch. She would give them something worth watching. One afternoon, she received a letter from the Department of Justice, inviting her to consult on a nationwide judicial ethics reform panel. It was a rare request, almost unprecedented. She knew what it meant. Her voice had reached beyond Birmingham. Her actions had resonated. The system had heard her, and now it wanted to ask her what came next. But the most unexpected moment came not from institutions or cameras, but from a small, quiet lunch downtown. She had gone to a local diner, one she frequented often before the spotlight found her. She sat alone at the counter, sipping coffee, reading a brief. And then, from the corner of the room, a woman approached. Middle-aged, sharply dressed, cautious. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the woman said. "I just wanted to say. I work internal audit at the courthouse. I was there, that day. I didn't say anything. I didn't stop him. And I've thought about that every day since." Monique looked up, meeting her gaze. "You don't owe me an apology," she said softly. The woman shook her head. "Maybe not. But I needed to say it anyway. Anne. I've started documenting things. Quietly. Things we've all let slide. If there's ever anything you need, evidence, patterns, records, I'll help. You shouldn't be alone in this." Monique smiled. "Then maybe I never was. That night, she stood in front of her living room window, city lights flickering in the distance. She thought about all the rooms where decisions were made. All the doors she had pushed through. All the hands that had tried to push her back out. And still, here she was. The courthouse would open again tomorrow. A new case. A new face. A new truth waiting to be heard. And she would be ready. Not because she hadn't been shaken, but because she had. And still chose to stand. The day Monique Harris received the official notice of her nomination to the appellate court, the sky over Birmingham was calm, painted in soft hues of gold and blue. The letter came in a simple envelope, no fanfare, no public statement, just a quiet confirmation that the system she had once feared might reject her had instead chosen to elevate her. It wasn't a victory rooted in politics or popularity, but in principle. The woman they had tried to dismiss, tried to intimidate, tried to silence, had been given one of the most powerful legal voices in the state. And she had earned every syllable of it. In the months that followed her testimony and the reforms she helped catalyze, Monique didn't slow down. She continued presiding with the same rigor, compassion, and unwavering sense of fairness that had always defined her. But her courtroom now felt different. The people who walked through its doors knew her story. They carried with them the knowledge that behind the bench sat someone who had stood against injustice, not just with words, but with action. Defense attorneys showed more care in their arguments. Prosecutors reviewed their evidence twice. Officers held their reports with a little more accountability. Because they knew the standard had shifted. And no one wanted to be the next story. Officer Bradley Kinley's story, however, had taken a very different path. Following the investigation, he was officially terminated from the force. But what surprised many wasn't the termination, it was his silence afterward. No lawsuits. No press statements. No appearances on right-wing talk shows. He withdrew entirely from public life. Rumors swirled, some said he left the state, others that he was working construction under a different name. But Monique never once concerned herself with where he went. Justice, after all, isn't about watching someone fall. It's about ensuring they no longer have the power to push others down. And that power had been taken from him, not with vengeance, but with truth. Isaiah Bell graduated with honors from his high school the following spring. He applied to colleges with a personal essay titled, "The Day I Was Seen," and was accepted into 3 universities, eventually choosing to attend Howard. He sent Monique a letter in the summer before his first semester, thanking her, not just for believing in him, but for believing in herself when it mattered most. That letter now sat framed on her bookshelf, next to legal texts, family photos, and a quote she'd kept since her early days as a public defender: "Justice begins with the courage to confront what others refuse to see." The courthouse staff, once hesitant to speak, had changed too. The woman from internal audit who had approached Monique in the diner had quietly helped establish a new internal oversight committee, made up of independent members with no ties to law enforcement. It was a quiet revolution, one that Monique supported from behind the scenes. She didn't need her name on every reform. She just needed to know it was working. When her appellate court confirmation was finally announced publicly, it made headlines. Not just for the historic nature of it, she was the first black woman from her district to be appointed to that bench, but because of the integrity that had brought her there. At the ceremony, she gave a short speech, not to impress but to remind. "Justice," she said, "isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes, it's the decision to stand still when the world tells you to move. Sometimes, it's the decision to speak when silence would be easier. And sometimes, justice looks like a room full of people finally willing to listen." That moment was shared across the internet, replayed on news segments, quoted in articles. But for Monique, what mattered most was the quiet afterward, the sense of peace in knowing she had not only endured, but transformed. She hadn't compromised. She hadn't folded. She had become exactly the kind of judge she had once needed when she was younger. That was the real triumph. Now, as she looked over the city from her new chambers, High above the streets she had walked as a child, she allowed herself one long exhale. The journey hadn't been easy. It had been bruising, isolating at times, exhausting in ways words could never fully express. But it had been worth it. Because every choice she had made had echoed beyond the courtroom. Into classrooms. Into households. Into lives. And so now we ask you, the listener, the one who walked with us through this story, what would you have done in her place? Would you have spoken out, even if it meant risking everything? Would you have stayed silent to protect your seat, or used that seat to elevate others? These are the questions we must all carry. Because justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins with one decision. One voice. One refusal to accept things as they are. This story wasn't just about law. It was about dignity. About the price of truth. About the quiet power of doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. And now, the question is, what will you do with that truth? If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, if it made you reflect, then share it. Talk about it. Carry it with you. And if you want more stories like this, stories with soul, with impact, with unexpected twists that leave you thinking long after the last word, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Your next story is just around the corner. And trust us, you won't want to miss it.